The early morning fog clung to the edges of the military base like a silent witness to decades of routine and discipline. Soldiers moved in precise lines, their boots echoing against the concrete, while the young Sergeant James, modest in uniform and carrying the weight of invisible burdens, was quietly mocked behind his back. The higher-ranking officers, perched on the steps of the main command building, whispered and laughed, their words sharp and unnecessary. James felt the sting, but he walked steadily, head held high, as though the laughter bounced off him, invisible. No one knew the quiet determination burning inside him, a fire tempered by years of being underestimated, of seeing his potential overlooked, of being ridiculed for his humble origins. As he passed the drill field, he glimpsed the sneers and sideways glances from the soldiers he trained, their respect withheld by the bias and hierarchy that had marked his career. Today, however, something felt different. The air carried a tension that James couldn't yet name, a subtle shift in the undercurrent of the base. He had a secret, a weighty one that had been tucked away in the shadows of his life. Wealth, yes, but more importantly, the resources and influence he could summon silently to reshape not only his fate but the lives of those who had doubted him. Across the field, Colonel Stevens, a man whose authority radiated like a halo of intimidation, pointed at James and sneered in front of a group of soldiers. "Look at him," he said, voice dripping with scorn. "A sergeant pretending to be more than he is. What a joke." The soldiers shifted uneasily. Some dared a glance at James. Others tried to hide their reactions, caught between amusement and uncertainty. James's gaze met the colonel's, calm yet unyielding. There was no anger, no challenge, only a quiet acknowledgement that this humiliation, long endured, would be transformed. The seed of change had been planted, and its growth was imminent. The morning drills continued, each movement precise, each command obeyed, but James's mind was elsewhere. Every push-up, every march, felt like preparation for a battle no one else could see. He observed the soldiers' faces, their respect barely concealed under the rigid discipline, and felt a pang of empathy. These were men and women constrained by routine, unaware of the storm brewing in the quietest sergeant among them. Colonel Stevens's laughter echoed again as he passed, a cruel punctuation to James's silent march. "I hope everyone sees this," he said, his eyes scanning the line. "The man we expect so little from is at it again. What a spectacle." The soldiers exchanged uneasy glances. The hierarchy was clear, the derision tangible, yet beneath it, something stirred, a flicker of doubt in those who watched too closely. James didn't flinch. Instead, he allowed a small, almost imperceptible smile to cross his face, a signal to himself, a private acknowledgement of the plan that had long been forming. He had resources hidden away, contacts cultivated in silence, and now, the time had come to orchestrate the subtle but unrelenting reversal of fortune. He would show them all, not with anger, but with undeniable proof that status, respect, and power were never solely about rank. They were about vision, resilience, and quiet strategy. By the afternoon, whispers of James's unusual confidence had spread. The soldiers noticed subtle changes, a calm authority in his tone, an assuredness in his posture, a presence that demanded attention without demanding obedience. The colonel's eyes narrowed as he caught the shift, sensing that the underestimation he had counted on for years was beginning to crumble. And somewhere in the back of the line, the young recruits who had never dared to speak to James now found themselves stealing glances, wondering what lay behind that quiet smile, that composed exterior. The first seeds of a reversal, imperceptible to most, had been sown. By mid-morning, the base seemed to vibrate with an almost imperceptible tension. James moved through the training grounds with the fluidity of a man who had long learned to blend into the background, unnoticed yet observing everything. Every detail mattered: the soldiers' expressions, the colonel's subtle gestures, the way whispers carried over the asphalt. It was all part of the intricate web he had been quietly mapping for months. The colonel, oblivious to the storm gathering just beneath the surface, continued his daily routine of derision, highlighting James's humble origins to anyone who would listen. "Remember, this is what we call mediocrity in uniform," he said loudly, and a few junior officers chuckled nervously, afraid to appear too serious in the presence of authority. The laughter hit the air like sharp steel, cutting through the fog that hung low over the base. James's mind, however, was elsewhere. He had arranged subtle changes over the past year, securing anonymous contributions to improve the living conditions of the barracks, funding scholarships for the soldiers' families, and quietly establishing programs to reward merit over lineage or rank. None of this was visible to the naked eye, but the impact would be undeniable. Today, the first public sign of his influence would appear, and those who mocked him would finally see the truth. He paused at the edge of the parade ground, surveying the scene. A group of soldiers struggled with outdated equipment, their frustration palpable. James stepped forward, offering guidance not as a scolding superior, but as someone who understood the limitations imposed on them. His instructions were precise, yet gentle. He corrected mistakes without arrogance, all while allowing the soldiers to feel capable, seen, and respected. Whispers began to ripple through the ranks. The soldiers noticed the difference. Someone who had long been ridiculed was acting with authority and competence, yet without the oppressive weight that often accompanied high rank. Even the younger recruits, who had never spoken to him, began to exchange impressed glances. Something was changing, and it wasn't just James, it was the perception of what leadership could be. From across the yard, the colonel's piercing gaze locked onto James. A frown formed, subtle but sharp, as he registered the shift. James's confidence, so calm yet undeniable, was not just resilience. It was the quiet prelude to a reckoning. By afternoon, the effect of James's actions began to ripple beyond the immediate training exercises. Small gestures, unnoticed by most, had started to accumulate into visible change. A supply room now neatly organized, drills executed with renewed precision, soldiers beginning to smile rather than grimace under pressure. James moved through it all like a conductor, orchestrating improvements without making his presence about self-aggrandizement. Colonel Stevens, however, was growing restless. The subtle respect the soldiers were beginning to show James was unacceptable in his rigid hierarchy. "Why are they listening to him?" he muttered under his breath, his voice sharp enough to catch the attention of a few nearby officers. He approached James directly, his posture rigid, a living embodiment of authority and intimidation. "Sergeant, I hope you're not trying to play at being an officer," he said, tone loaded with condescension. The soldiers around stiffened, some glancing nervously between the two, anticipating conflict. James did not flinch. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, meeting the colonel's gaze evenly. There was no fear, no challenge, just a composed acknowledgement that his actions had already begun to change the perception of who held real influence within the base. "Just doing my duty, sir," he replied evenly, his voice carrying a calm authority that unsettled the colonel more than any anger could have. A few soldiers, previously hesitant, now dared to watch more openly, their expressions a mixture of surprise and admiration. The irony was palpable. The man they had laughed at, scorned for his background and modest uniform, was quietly demonstrating the very qualities their leaders often failed to exemplify. James walked away then, allowing the scene to settle into the subconscious of the observers. The tension in the air was now thick, not of ridicule, but of anticipation. Something significant was brewing, and even the colonel, with all his experience and power, could sense it. The first whispers of his eventual revelation, the moment that would transform mockery into awe, were spreading quietly, unseen but unstoppable. Evening draped the base in long blue shadows, the dim lights casting elongated shapes across the asphalt. James stood near the perimeter, quietly observing the soldiers returning from their drills. Their exhaustion was evident, yet so was a subtle spark, a small glimmer of pride in their posture, in the way they carried their equipment, and even in the faintly triumphant smiles that passed between them. These were minor details, almost imperceptible, but for James they were everything. He reflected on the countless moments when the colonel's scorn had felt like a physical weight pressing down on his shoulders. Those moments were sharp knives of humiliation, etched deeply into his memory. And yet, rather than breaking him, they had honed his perception, sharpened his patience, and taught him the quiet art of observation. Every insult, every chuckle at his expense, had become raw material for the transformation he was quietly orchestrating. Inside the main barracks, whispers began circulating. "Did you see the new layout? Did you notice how he handled the drills?" Young recruits exchanged odd glances. The sergeant they had mocked, the one who carried the weight of lowly rank and modest upbringing, had begun to manifest authority without aggression, competence without arrogance. It was a paradox that unsettled the usual order. Colonel Stevens, pacing near the officers' quarters, was aware of the shift even before the whispers reached him. Each time he passed a group of soldiers, their eyes lingered slightly longer on James, a subtle nod here, a barely perceptible gesture there. The colonel's jaw tightened. He felt an unfamiliar sense of losing control. Authority, he realized with sudden dread, was not just enforced, it was acknowledged, earned. James, sensing the culmination of months of subtle influence, allowed himself a brief smile. The soldier's loyalty was growing, not out of fear, but out of genuine respect. And soon, very soon, the truth of his identity, the depth of his unseen contributions would emerge. It would be quiet at first, like the slow turning of a key in a lock, but once it fully revealed itself, the moral shock would be irreversible. He glanced at the setting sun reflecting off the metal surfaces of the vehicles and equipment. In that moment, the base seemed alive with anticipation. Every soldier, every officer, every echoing footstep was part of a grand stage, and the sergeant, once dismissed and ridiculed, was on the brink of the ultimate revelation. Night fell over the base like a velvet curtain, transforming the harsh lines of concrete into softened silhouettes. James moved quietly through the mess hall, unnoticed by most, his presence barely more than a shadow. But tonight, unlike previous nights, there was a subtle tension in the air, almost electric. The soldiers' eyes followed him more closely. Their whispers carried a new undertone, curiosity mixed with respect. Colonel Stevens, seated at his usual table with senior officers, watched from a distance. He could feel it, the intangible shift in the atmosphere. The mockery he had relied on to assert dominance was fading, replaced by a growing sense of intrigue around James. It was unnerving. The colonel could not command respect through fear alone. Respect was now being quietly claimed elsewhere. In the training yard outside, a group of soldiers were assembling for a late-night drill, practicing maneuvers under the dim floodlights. James approached, giving concise instructions, correcting errors with a calm authority. He did not shout, did not demand, but the effectiveness of his guidance was undeniable. Movements became sharper, reactions faster, coordination smoother. The soldiers responded instinctively, without hesitation, as if sensing an unspoken competence in their leader. A young recruit, barely 18, whispered to his friend, "I don't know what he did, but he's different. He actually knows what he's doing." The friend nodded, eyes wide, a mixture of awe and disbelief. These were the seeds of transformation, small yet potent, planted carefully over time, now beginning to sprout visibly. Colonel Stevens approached James at the edge of the yard, every step radiating authority, every inch of his posture demanding attention. "Sergeant, why are you teaching them things you shouldn't even know?" His tone was edged with contempt, but it lacked the bite it once held. James looked at him evenly, calm but firm. "Sir, I am simply doing my duty. These men deserve every opportunity to succeed, just as I do." His voice carried not arrogance, but undeniable assurance. The words hit the colonel differently than he expected. The quiet strength behind them was impossible to ignore. Behind them, other soldiers watched in silence, faces revealing a mixture of surprise, admiration, and growing hope. The moment was fleeting, yet it was monumental. The sergeant, dismissed and underestimated, had begun to shift the moral balance of the base. And when the truth of his past finally surfaced, the impact would resonate far beyond this night, leaving a shockwave of reckoning that no mockery could withstand. The first hints of dawn crept across the base, painting the concrete barracks with a soft amber glow. James stood at the edge of the training ground, hands clasped behind his back, surveying the soldiers as they carried out their morning drills. There was a quiet efficiency in their movements now, a cohesion that had not existed before. He could see the subtle changes, the trust forming in their eyes, the unspoken acknowledgement of his guidance. Colonel Stevens appeared at the top of the steps leading to the officers' quarters, his sharp gaze scanning the yard. He had spent countless mornings here, asserting dominance with words, with presence, with the silent weight of rank. And yet, today he felt unease. The soldiers' eyes did not flicker toward him with habitual respect. They lingered on James with a mixture of curiosity and confidence that unsettled him. A group of recruits stumbled during a complex maneuver, and James's voice broke the morning calm. Slow down, focus on each step. Trust yourselves. Trust the process. His tone was calm, yet layered with authority, every word precise. The soldiers adjusted their movements instinctively, listening not to a superior demanding obedience, but to a mentor commanding respect. The colonel stepped forward, attempting to assert control. "Sergeant, remind them of the regulations. They're not here for improvisation." His voice carried the edge of command, yet the effect was weaker than ever before. James simply nodded, acknowledging the colonel without defiance, and then proceeded to demonstrate the drill himself. Every movement was deliberate, controlled, precise. The soldiers mirrored him, following his lead. By the time the colonel realized it, the group was performing with flawless execution. A ripple of quiet admiration spread among them. Even the youngest, the ones who had once mocked James, were now exchanging glances of surprise and respect. The colonel's jaw tightened. He had built authority through intimidation and status, but authority born of skill, patience, and genuine care had started to eclipse him. And though James had not yet revealed his full secret, the undercurrent was clear. The moral balance of the base was shifting. James allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. The journey had been slow, painful, filled with ridicule and disregard. Yet each calculated step, each small act of perseverance, was leading toward this moment, the quiet before the revelation. Soon, very soon, the truth would surface, leaving no one indifferent, and no disrespect unpunished by the natural order of justice. The sun climbed higher, casting golden shafts of light across the grounds. James walked among the soldiers, offering corrections, encouragements, and occasional praise. His eyes caught the subtle gestures of gratitude and admiration, the faint nods, the quick, respectful glances. It was not blind obedience. It was recognition of genuine capability and integrity. Colonel Stevens watched from the sidelines, his hand gripping the railing. Every display of competence from James was a silent indictment of his previous underestimations. Every moment of leadership a reminder of the humiliation he had inflicted. Yet he could not openly confront James without appearing petty. The soldiers' eyes were watching, and the subtle power dynamic had shifted irreversibly. A young recruit, sweating and exhausted, stumbled during a complex formation. James's hand barely lifted to steady him, yet the gesture carried weight. "You can do this. Remember your training, trust yourself," he said softly. It was a voice that conveyed trust and calm authority, without arrogance or condescension. The recruit's eyes met his, and a spark of confidence ignited. In the back of the yard, the other soldiers whispered amongst themselves. "Have you noticed how he guides us? Without yelling, without pushing, but everything feels right." Their whispers carried the realization that James's leadership was different, rooted in experience, empathy, and quiet strength. The colonel, now visibly tense, approached. "Sergeant, stop showing them up. They must respect the chain of command." His words were clipped, sharp, yet they lacked the intimidation they once held. James's calm gaze met the colonel's. "Respect is earned, sir, not demanded. And these men are capable of far more than you allow them to see." A hush fell over the yard. Soldiers froze mid-step, eyes wide, sensing the subtle confrontation. The young sergeant, once ridiculed and dismissed, now commanded the attention of everyone, even the highest-ranking officer present. It was the first hint of a moral shock, a foreshadowing of the truth that would soon emerge. James turned, gesturing for the soldiers to continue. They resumed, movements precise, synchronized, and confident. The colonel stepped back, jaw tight, realizing the inevitable. The foundation of authority had begun to shift, and no rank alone could reverse it. The morning was quiet, yet charged with anticipation. Every soldier felt it, the promise of change, the stirrings of respect, and the looming revelation that would soon overturn every assumption about the young sergeant they had once mocked. The afternoon sun beat down on the base, casting long shadows across the training grounds. James moved among the soldiers, observing, correcting, and quietly guiding. Each glance he exchanged with them carried unspoken communication. Trust, expectation, and the subtle assertion of authority built on merit, not title. The young men and women who had once whispered and snickered at him now followed every instruction with silent reverence. Colonel Stevens lingered nearby, attempting to assert his presence with a measured step and a sharp glance, but it was increasingly clear that his efforts were futile. Authority imposed through rank alone could not compete with the natural leadership that James radiated. Each movement, each word from the young sergeant was precise, deliberate, and imbued with an integrity that was impossible to ignore. A drill concluded, and the soldiers lined up. James walked along the formation, inspecting each man and woman. A subtle nod, a gentle correction, a few words of encouragement. These small gestures were more powerful than any order shouted from a balcony. A ripple of admiration spread quietly among the ranks. Even the quietest soldiers, the ones who had previously doubted him, met his gaze with a newfound respect that shone brighter than the noonday sun. The colonel approached, his face tight with restrained irritation. "Sergeant, remember your place. These men must follow the chain of command," he barked, attempting to inject authority where respect no longer lingered. James looked up slowly, his calm expression unwavering. "Sir," he said softly, yet with an undeniable strength. "Respect cannot be demanded, and leadership cannot be forced. They already follow what is true and just." The colonel's eyes narrowed. Behind him, a few soldiers shifted uneasily, sensing the tension, the shift in the invisible hierarchy. The moral imbalance was clear. The young sergeant, once humiliated, dismissed, and underestimated, had now become the pivot around which the base turned. And all the while, the truth of James's past remained carefully hidden, a force waiting to awaken the storm. James's gaze moved across the formation, lingering on the hesitant soldiers who were learning to trust themselves. Each small success, each moment of recognition, was a step toward the inevitable revelation that would shatter assumptions, rewrite loyalties, and leave no one untouched. The day's heat bore down on the base, but the simmering tension and quiet admiration burned hotter, preparing the stage for the ultimate confrontation. Evening approached, painting the barracks in deep orange and muted violet shadows. James stood on the parade ground, watching the last drills of the day. The soldiers executed each maneuver with precision and confidence, their movements a silent tribute to the guidance and mentorship that had replaced ridicule and mockery. The shift was undeniable. A subtle hierarchy of respect had been established, and James's presence was at the center. Colonel Stevens observed from the upper steps of the officers' quarters, his arms crossed tightly. There was a storm behind his calm exterior, a mixture of disbelief, irritation, and the first flickers of fear. Authority built on intimidation and fear was crumbling before his eyes, replaced by a moral leadership that demanded attention, respect, and genuine loyalty. A young private stumbled during a particularly complex drill. James moved quickly but subtly, placing a hand near the soldier's shoulder. Not to correct, but to steady, to guide. Focus. Trust your training. You are capable, he murmured. The private's eyes widened in recognition, confidence replacing doubt, and a ripple of silent acknowledgement spread across the formation. The colonel stepped forward, tension evident in every muscle. "Sergeant, stop showing them up. This is not your place," he barked, his voice trembling ever so slightly. James met his gaze evenly, calm and unflinching. "Sir," he replied, voice steady, "my place is wherever the truth of their potential is revealed, and today they are capable of more than anyone, including yourself, believed possible." A hush fell over the yard. The soldiers froze mid-step, witnessing the confrontation. The moral reversal was palpable. The seeds of doubt had taken root in the highest rank, and the young sergeant's influence radiated outward, reaching every corner of the base. The tension was electric, an unspoken promise that change was coming, that the hidden truths waiting beneath layers of secrecy and restraint would soon emerge. The last rays of sunlight glimmered off the metal buttons and medals adorning the officers' uniforms, reflecting both literal and symbolic light. In the soft glow of dusk, James walked away from the formation, leaving a silent message etched in every soldier's mind. Respect is earned through integrity, courage, and action. And the ultimate revelation, the one that would shock and redefine the base, was on the horizon. The night descended over the base, thick with the smell of rain-dampened earth and oil from the maintenance sheds. James walked alone through the empty parade ground, his boots splashing in shallow puddles, each step echoing in the silent expanse. He didn't speak. There was no need. The weight of unspoken history, the humiliation he had endured, and the quiet strength he had cultivated pressed heavily against his shoulders. In the shadows, the faint light from the barracks flickered, illuminating the faces of soldiers lingering on their balconies. Their eyes followed him, curiosity, respect, and a glimmer of hope shining through the fatigue of their daily drills. They had watched him rise without fanfare, without exploiting authority, but through consistent demonstration of skill, intelligence, and integrity. And now, even in the dead of night, his presence alone inspired vigilance and reflection. Colonel Stevens had not left the officers' quarters. Through the small window, he watched James move, noting every deliberate gesture, every measured stride. Attention pulled at him, a strange mix of fear, admiration, and anger that he could not fully name. Authority founded solely on rank and prestige had proven brittle in the face of quiet competence and moral strength. James paused near the central flagpole, looking up at the stars faintly reflected in the wet asphalt. Memories of the past, a life of struggle, whispered mockeries from those meant to guide him, and the subtle sneers of higher-ranking officers clashed violently with the present. He had endured, silently, learning, observing, and building power where it mattered, in the hearts of those he led. From the corner of his eye, a small group of soldiers approached, their faces illuminated by moonlight and the faint glow of distant floodlights. No words were spoken. None were needed. Their reverence, their loyalty, and their trust were already evident in their posture, their careful steps, their watchful eyes. James merely nodded, acknowledging the unspoken bond. In that moment, even in the solitude of night, he was more than a sergeant. He was a presence, a living testament to resilience and quiet triumph. The night held its breath. Somewhere, a distant dog barked, a storm approached on the horizon, and the promise of revelation waited just beyond the edges of darkness. James knew that dawn would bring more than light. It would bring truth, and the reckoning that had silently built for months would finally arrive. Dawn broke with a hesitant glow, softening the edges of the base with muted gold and faint rose hues. James stood atop the small hill overlooking the training grounds, watching soldiers file into formation for morning exercises. Their movements were sharp, disciplined, and charged with a quiet confidence, a reflection of his guidance and steadfast leadership. Colonel Stevens approached from the officers' mess, his polished boots crunching against gravel. He carried his usual air of authority, yet today there was something different. an unspoken acknowledgement that the dynamics had shifted. James, his posture calm but unwavering, met the colonel's gaze without flinching. The air between them was taut, charged with the friction of past humiliation and present inevitability. "Sergeant," the colonel said carefully, "today you lead the drills." His tone attempted neutrality, but the subtle tremor betrayed the tension beneath. James inclined his head slightly, as if to say, not with arrogance, but with purpose. He stepped forward, signaling the soldiers to attention. Their eyes, sharp and attentive, followed his every movement. The drills commenced, a series of complex maneuvers requiring precision, timing, and mutual trust. James guided silently, a mere shift of stance, a slight adjustment of hands, a measured word here and there. Each correction was subtle but transformative. Soldiers who once doubted themselves moved with newfound assurance, their hesitance replaced by strength and confidence. The colonel observed, his expression unreadable. Behind him, junior officers whispered among themselves, sharing nervous glances. Respect had quietly migrated from the rank and file toward James, unspoken but impossible to ignore. Authority rooted in fear and hierarchy had begun to crumble under the weight of skill, empathy, and the relentless consistency of a man who refused to bow to mockery. As the sun climbed higher, casting long golden beams over the parade ground, James halted the formation. Silence spread across the base, heavy and anticipatory. In that suspended moment, every soldier knew. The young sergeant they had once mocked had become the true pillar of their strength. And somewhere, deep within the hierarchy, a reckoning stirred. A revelation that would challenge assumptions, rewrite loyalties, and leave no one untouched. The midday sun cast sharp reflections off the metallic surfaces of the base, creating a grid of light and shadow over the sprawling training grounds. James walked among the soldiers, not as a superior, but as a guide, a silent observer of their potential. His presence commanded no fear, only respect, a subtle force that resonated through every posture, every step, every glance. He noticed the young recruits hesitating during a complex drill. The memory of his own early days, when ridicule was constant and the weight of expectation unbearable, stirred quietly within him. He moved closer, his approach calm but intentional. With a barely perceptible gesture, he adjusted a soldier's stance, demonstrating the precision required without a word of rebuke. The young man's eyes widened, not with fear, but with understanding, as if an invisible burden had been lifted. Colonel Stevens watched from the balcony above, his hands clasped behind his back. There was a tightness in his jaw, an unfamiliar tension in the lines of his face. Authority had always been his to wield, unquestioned, and yet, here was a man younger, lower in rank, demonstrating a command that transcended titles. The irony was bitter, yet undeniable. James did not flaunt power, he embodied it. And the truth of his influence was evident in the soldiers who followed him without hesitation, without need for coercion. A distant whistle cut through the air, signaling the next phase of exercises. James turned, guiding his squad through a series of tactical maneuvers, each more demanding than the last. Sweat gleamed on foreheads, mud-stained uniforms, and every movement was synchronized under his calm, unyielding direction. The bond between leader and soldier was palpable, trust forged in silent understanding rather than fear. And then, a subtle shift in the formation caught the attention of every observer. Soldiers who had once flinched under criticism now moved with confidence, anticipating instructions, completing tasks with a fluidity that spoke of quiet excellence. James' gaze swept across them, noting every improvement, every spark of realization. They were growing not merely as soldiers but as a unit. The seeds of loyalty, planted in silent resilience, were beginning to blossom. The afternoon air was heavy with heat and anticipation, the sun glinting off wet asphalt where recent rain had pooled. James stood at the edge of the parade ground, watching a group of soldiers conduct a tactical simulation. Every misstep was a lesson, every success, a shared triumph. His eyes, steady and calculating, observed not just technique, but the spirit behind each action. Colonel Stevens approached cautiously, attempting conversation as if casual inspection could mask the growing unease. "Sergeant, your methods, unconventional," he began, his tone carrying a practiced authority that now sounded brittle, like a fragile facade. James did not reply immediately. He merely tilted his head, allowing the officer to feel the weight of silence. In that pause, the power dynamic shifted imperceptibly. Respect was no longer demanded. It was earned, observed, and undeniable. A sudden clatter echoed across the training ground, a misstep during a complex drill. The soldiers froze for an instant, expecting reprimand. Instead, James calmly assessed, then demonstrated the correct execution, guiding hands and stance with precision. The young recruits watched, absorbing every movement, every subtle adjustment. The atmosphere was electric, charged with the quiet energy of transformation. The colonel's eyes narrowed. His mind raced with recollections of past humiliations, of the sneers he once received from a man now commanding not only attention, but admiration. The soldiers whispered among themselves, their hushed tones carrying awe rather than fear. James had become more than a sergeant. He was a fulcrum upon which the morale and destiny of the unit pivoted. As the sun began its descent, shadows lengthened, painting the parade ground in dramatic contrast. James' silhouette, steady and resolute, projected authority and calm, humility and strength intertwined. The soldiers, inspired by silent leadership, moved with a cohesion that transcended instruction, a unity born from respect, earned quietly, relentlessly. And in the distance, the colonel realized the truth. The young sergeant, once mocked, once dismissed, now held the heart of the base in his hands. Humiliation, once a weapon against him, had transformed into an unshakable foundation for leadership. The tide had turned, and nothing would ever be the same. Twilight settled over the base, painting the sky in deep purples and muted golds. The air was thick with the residual heat of the day, mingling with the faint scent of wet earth and metal from the recent drills. James walked along the perimeter, his boots crunching lightly on gravel. Each step carried weight, not the weight of command, but of responsibility, of understanding the fragile balance between respect and fear. He stopped near a group of young soldiers, their faces still flushed from exertion, their eyes searching for approval, for validation that they were not merely pawns in a rigid hierarchy. James studied them quietly. He could see the anxiety buried beneath the uniforms, the unspoken fear of making a mistake in front of authority. He knelt slightly, meeting their gaze at eye level, a subtle act of equality that conveyed more than any words could. The effect was immediate, a flicker of relief, of trust, in their expressions. From the balcony above, Colonel Stevens observed silently. The lines in his face were sharper now, the tension in his posture betraying unease he could not voice. Authority, he realized with a bitter sting, was no longer his sole domain. James wielded influence not through intimidation, but through a quiet magnetism, a mastery of human understanding. Every action, every glance, every measured word carried the weight of truth, and the soldiers responded instinctively. A distant drum sounded, signaling the next phase of evening exercises. James rose and moved with deliberate ease, guiding his squad through increasingly complex tactical maneuvers. Mist from the lingering humidity clung to their uniforms, highlighting every precise movement, every moment of synchronized action. The young recruits, once hesitant and uncertain, now moved with fluidity, their motions reflecting not only skill but confidence. The difference was subtle yet profound, a transformation from doubt to resolve. The colonel's gaze hardened, a mixture of awe and envy warring within him. He had once mocked the man now commanding attention effortlessly, dismissing him as an unremarkable sergeant. But the truth was inescapable. Respect had shifted, quietly, irrevocably. The soldier's loyalty was earned, not demanded, and it radiated like an invisible current, connecting every member of the unit in a shared acknowledgement of leadership that transcended rank. Night deepened, casting long shadows across the base's training grounds. Lanterns flickered, throwing fragmented light over the meticulously maintained asphalt and the metallic glint of equipment. James stood in the center, observing a small group navigating a tactical scenario in near darkness. Each movement, precise and deliberate, carried a weight beyond simple drills. It was a test of courage, intuition, and trust. A young recruit hesitated, faltering under the scrutiny of his peers. James' eyes softened, capturing both the fear and potential in the soldier. With a slight gesture, a tilt of the head, he guided him without a word, demonstrating the next maneuver with quiet authority. The boy's shoulders squared, the hesitation vanished, replaced by a quiet confidence. It was a moment of revelation, the understanding that guidance could be firm yet gentle, commanding yet compassionate. Colonel Stevens watched from the shadows of the observation tower, his mind swirling with frustration. The structure of power he had relied upon for decades was shifting beneath his feet. Authority no longer came from rank alone. It came from understanding, from connecting with the very hearts of those he sought to command. And James, young, unassuming, and previously overlooked, had mastered it with an ease that was both infuriating and admirable. A sudden whistle pierced the night, a call to regroup. James moved among the soldiers, his presence steady, reassuring, silently conveying that mistakes were part of growth, that courage was measured not by perfection but by persistence. The unit responded instinctively, every movement synchronized, every action reflecting the influence of a leader whose power was rooted in empathy, strategy, and subtle dominance. The colonel clenched his jaw. He had underestimated the young sergeant, had ignored the quiet brilliance that now commanded the respect of the entire base. The soldiers whispered among themselves, their voices low but fervent, marveling at the skill and calm authority James exhibited. What had been scorn and ridicule was now a testament to resilience, a prelude to triumph. Leadership, they realized, was not about wealth or title. It was about presence, conviction, and the courage to inspire. The base was cloaked in silence, the kind that comes after exertion and accomplishment. The faint hum of distant generators and the occasional rustle of leaves were the only sounds that accompanied James as he moved along the dimly lit pathways. The night was cool, carrying the scent of dew and metal, a stark contrast to the tension-filled hours before. He paused near the mess hall, where a few soldiers lingered, quietly discussing the day's exercises. Their voices were low, respectful, tinged with admiration and curiosity. James observed them without interrupting, noting the subtle changes in demeanor. The hesitant nods that had once been timid bows of submission were now confident gestures, a reflection of the trust and respect he had cultivated. Every drill, every moment of guidance, had been a brick in the foundation of authority he was building, not through intimidation, but through genuine understanding. He allowed himself a brief smile, a silent acknowledgement of progress achieved. From the shadows of the observation tower, Colonel Stevens' gaze never wavered. The older man's face was a canvas of conflicting emotions, pride, envy, and a creeping realization that his long-held control was eroding. He had mocked this young sergeant countless times, dismissing him as inconsequential, yet here he stood, commanding influence in a way Stevens had never achieved. Power, he understood now, was not solely a product of rank. It was earned, quietly, through presence, empathy, and the ability to inspire. Suddenly, the night air was pierced by the sharp clang of falling equipment. A recruit had stumbled while carrying supplies. James reacted instinctively, moving to the young man with a calm yet commanding presence. The hesitation in the soldier's eyes melted under the steady gaze of his sergeant, replaced by determination. The incident was minor, yet its significance was monumental. Leadership was in these moments, in the quiet correction, the unspoken reassurance, the ability to transform fear into confidence. The colonel exhaled slowly, his hands gripping the railing as he witnessed the subtle revolution taking place before him. Respect was no longer given. It was demanded and returned in equal measure. James had become the fulcrum around which the base now turned, unseen but undeniable, shaping not just the performance but the very spirit of his men. Every glance, every measured word, every calculated silence was a demonstration of authority rooted in mastery of human emotion. Dawn crept across the horizon, painting the base in pale gold and soft lavender. Mist clung to the edges of the asphalt, curling around the boots of soldiers assembling for morning drills. James stood at the center, his silhouette calm, composed, a silent conductor orchestrating the rhythm of movement and discipline. Each soldier mirrored his energy, their motions deliberate yet fluid, reflecting the hours of guidance and trust invested. A younger recruit faltered, unsure of the next maneuver. James' eyes met his, steady and unwavering, transmitting a quiet assurance. He approached, not to correct but to demonstrate, to guide without words. The soldier's posture shifted imperceptibly, shoulders squared, gaze sharpened. Confidence, once absent, now flowed through him, a gift granted not by force but by the patient authority of someone who understood the weight of expectation and the fear of failure. Above, the colonel observed with a mixture of disbelief and reluctant admiration. He had underestimated the young sergeant, dismissed him, ridiculed him, yet here he was, commanding respect without a single raised voice. Authority had shifted subtly, invisibly, and the soldier's allegiance had silently realigned. The base, once a symbol of rigid hierarchy, now functioned under a different rhythm, one guided by empathy, insight, and strategic presence. The mist thickened as a horn signaled the next exercise. James moved among the troops, correcting, encouraging, inspiring, each interaction a testament to the quiet power he wielded. The soldiers responded instinctively, a fluid choreography born of respect and trust rather than fear. The colonel clenched his jaw. He realized, with reluctant clarity, that mockery and rank had never been enough. Leadership was deeper, more nuanced, rooted in the ability to touch the hearts of those you commanded. As the sun rose fully, bathing the base in golden light, James paused to observe the synchronized movement of his unit. The transformation was undeniable. What had begun as ridicule and doubt had evolved into admiration, loyalty, and cohesion. Every soldier, every action, every glance told the story of a sergeant who had been underestimated, humiliated, yet had emerged not just victorious, but transformative, a beacon of courage, strategy, and humanity. The afternoon sun burned softly against the base's barracks, casting long shadows that stretched across the asphalt like silent witnesses to the day's discipline. James walked through the ranks, not with the arrogance of a man elevated by rank, but with the quiet certainty of someone who had endured, observed, and understood. His uniform, neat but unpretentious, reflected his personal integrity more than any badge of status ever could. He paused near a group of younger soldiers, noticing the nervous energy that lingered in the space between them. Their whispers were hushed, not out of fear but from the weight of expectation. His presence alone had become a lesson, a standard they measured themselves against. James knelt subtly, not to humiliate, not to instruct harshly, but to observe, to guide, to instill confidence. Each movement was calculated, precise, and full of purpose. From the observation tower, Colonel Stevens' eyes tracked James with an intensity he could barely contain. The older man's mind churned with disbelief and a grudging admiration he would never openly admit. He had spent decades defining authority through strict commands and the unyielding power of rank, only to witness the young sergeant wield influence in ways that were far more potent and enduring. Respect had been earned here, through action, patience, and quiet intelligence, not merely decreed. A sudden alarm rang through the base, a simulated threat exercise. Soldiers reacted instantly, moving with coordinated precision, each action a reflection of James' meticulous training. He moved fluidly among them, correcting, directing, inspiring without raising his voice. Each subtle gesture amplified the cohesion of the unit. The tension in the colonel's shoulders grew, a silent acknowledgement that his perception of control was shifting irrevocably. By evening, the drills concluded. James stood alone at the center of the parade ground, the fading sun illuminating his features. Sweat glistened, uniform slightly damp, yet his posture radiated confidence and calm. The soldiers assembled behind him, their faces a mixture of exhaustion and pride. They had not only learned skills, they had absorbed a philosophy of leadership that transcended mere obedience. Night fell over the base, bringing with it a serene silence broken only by the distant murmur of the barracks. James walked along the lit pathway toward the central command building, each step echoing softly against the concrete. The transformation he had orchestrated was evident everywhere. Discipline, morale, and mutual respect now permeated the base like an invisible current, shifting the culture from fear to inspired loyalty. The colonel approached, his tall silhouette cutting a long shadow. There was a pause between them, a silent acknowledgement of battles fought and lessons learned. Stevens, usually stern and unyielding, offered a subtle nod. It was recognition without words, a concession that James had reshaped the hierarchy not through arrogance, but through competence, empathy, and vision. James glanced at the soldiers lingering near the edges of the courtyard. Their eyes reflected awe and trust, an unspoken bond forged in the fires of both hardship and redemption. They were witnesses to the sergeant who had been mocked, underestimated, and humiliated, yet emerged not just victorious but transformative, a figure whose influence extended far beyond rank or title. In that moment, James understood the true measure of leadership. It was not the medals, the commands, or the approval of superiors. It was the ability to inspire change, to touch lives, and to leave a lasting impact. The base itself seemed to hum with renewed purpose, a testament to what one individual could achieve when guided by principle, courage, and empathy. As he finally turned to leave, a faint breeze carried the distant laughter and chatter of soldiers, now infused with genuine respect. James allowed himself a rare smile, knowing the story of this base, these men, and this transformation would endure. And to those watching, learning from these lessons of resilience, courage, and moral triumph, remember to share your thoughts, leave a like, and subscribe to witness every step of the journey, because true leadership leaves echoes that resonate far beyond the barracks walls.